Welcome to Effective Instructional Planning, presented by the Department of Professional Learning for Clayton County Public Schools. The learning targets for this module include being able to develop a plan for instruction. You should also be able to demonstrate an understanding of effective instruction. And lastly, to be able to identify and use resources to effectively plan. When you're developing your plan, we'll begin with the START model of thinking for planning, followed by the deconstruction of standards. We'll then look at how you create learning targets, followed by vocabulary strategies, assessment strategies, and instructional strategies by using the gradual release model. So when we look at STARTs is simply a way of thinking. So when we are planning, when you start planning, the first thing you want to consider are your students. You want to look at the data that you have on your students, the students that you serve, and determine what are their instructional needs. Next, you want to look at the amount of time. How much time does your pacing guide allow? Is this time appropriate for what you need to teach? So you have to focus on that time, the sequencing, and the pacing in order to accomplish your goals for learning. Then you want to look at how will you assess students. Assessment is critical. How will you assess them informally throughout the learning process? And then how will they be assessed at the end of the learning? Then you want to focus on your resources. What resources do I have readily available? What resources do I need? You want to make sure that all of the resources that you use are aligned to your learning targets, aligned to your standards, and to the levels that your students need, their levels of readiness and their levels of skills. Then, what are your teaching techniques? What are your strategies that you're going to use in order to deliver the information and provide instruction for your students? You want to make sure that any methods that you use and any strategies that you use, that they are evidence-based. And then, of course, your standards. What are the standards? You want to make sure that you fully understand standards that you are teaching. You want to use that knowledge in order to create clear, specific goals for your students. So now that we know what START stands for, and we know what this line of thinking means, then every time that we begin to plan for student learning, we should keep all of these things in mind. So now when we look at effective instructional planning, we'll look at the various stages of the gradual release model. Direct explanation, modeling, guided practice, differentiation is a part of that guided practice, independent practice, and then reviewing and assessing students. So with direct explanation, the first thing you have to do is deconstruct the standards. You have to know what the standards mean in order to develop meaningful learning targets for your students. So how do you go from a standard to a learning target? Well, the first thing you want to do is perform what we call a close read of the standard. Then you want to determine what are the key vocabulary terms that my students need to know. So we will focus on those Tier 2 and Tier 3 vocabulary terms. And then lastly, we'll develop and establish those key learning targets for our students. When you perform the close read of the standard, you want to look at any teacher's notes, curriculum guides, any guidance documents that the district provides. You want to use those as a reference point. And then you want to look at how is this standard relevant to what I have to teach? What is its significance? What are the big ideas? What elements connect to the standard? What do my students need to know coming into this? How will I assess and determine what they already know? And then what might be some misconceptions that my students might have? Now, this is an example of one of the documents that we use to perform that close read. And you see it has all of those components and key considerations that we discussed previously. Step 2, look at the vocabulary. What is the language of the standard? Are these terms that your students are going to know and understand, or will you need to dig deeper and break down some of those words for them? You want to use guiding questions to determine the vocabulary that you should use and introduce to your students. And you want to make sure that you choose Tier 2 and Tier 3 words that are significant to their learning. When we look at these tiered levels of vocabulary, the reason we don't focus on Tier 1, those are everyday words that students should be familiar with and should have learned through conversation. But there will be times when you will need to practice those words with your students and make sure that they understand them. We can never assume that students will know all of the Tier 1 vocabulary. Tier 2, those are your high frequency terms. You'll find them cross-curricular. You'll find them in use by students all the time in other classes. So they may sometimes confuse the meanings of those words when it comes to your class. You want to make sure that you spend a good deal of time focusing on making sure that your students understand those meanings of those Tier 2 words. And then Tier 3, those are the terms that are domain specific to the content that you're teaching. So when we look at the Tier 2 words, those words, a lot of times, they will address cognitive skills. They may be connecting words or multiple meaning words. We typically don't teach those explicitly, but what we find is that students may recognize the words, but they may not really understand how to apply it to the content. Some examples of those words are analyze, explain, describe, strategy, and properties. So when we look at some of these words and we look at two different content areas, you'll see that in math and in science, those words that are highlighted in red are some of those connecting words. You see those in various content areas. And then if you look at the list below, you'll see that we have a list of words that are considered connecting words that you will find in multiple areas of content. Then we move on to the content-specific vocabulary, which is Tier 3. These terms are critical to your course, to the subject, and it is important that students understand these words and the information relative to the content that you're teaching. Now, if we look at this example of a standard, you'll see that the cognitive skill words are highlighted in red, the connecting words are highlighted in green, and then the Tier 3 content-specific vocabulary terms are highlighted in purple. So this helps you to see how a close read of the standard will help you identify those vocabulary terms that you need to teach for your students. Now moving into creating learning targets. So when you are writing your learning targets, typically we put them in the form of I can statements. Those statements will tell students exactly what they should know and or be able to do. And we break them down into 4 categories. They are either knowledge-based, based on reasoning, a skill they must master, or a product. So when we look at the different types of learning targets, I have some examples here of the words that you would use that represent that particular form of learning target. So we have the knowledge, which means that it's just basic information that students should know or concepts that they should learn. Then we have the reasoning, which handles the thinking skills and mental processes. It may involve higher order thinking and higher order reasoning. Then with skill, that is something that they should be able to do. And then, of course, with product, it is something that they should be able to create, make, build, design, or produce in some way. And so when you're writing your learning targets, these are some examples of the words that you can use or words that may be in the standard that indicate the type of learning target that you should create. Once you've gone through those stages, you've analyzed the standard, you've looked at the vocabulary and determined the key terms that you need to teach, and then you have created those learning targets. Now it's time to move into the full planning of the lesson. So we're going to look at vocabulary strategies, how you differentiate, the gradual release model, and then how will you assess students. So when you look at the vocabulary, once you've identified it, you have the key words they should know. Now you have to ask yourself, how am I going to model those effective word learning strategies for my students? And what will I have them do in order to learn this key vocabulary? So these are some examples of ways that you can teach vocabulary. You can use word maps. Pre-teaching always works. You, of course, want to have some type of word wall display so that students can have repeated exposure to words. And then you have Kim's charts, word clusters, Freire models, and the list goes on. So as you go through your different documents, your curriculum documents, sometimes they will have strategies for you. And then, of course, you can always research and find different ways to teach and incorporate vocabulary into the lesson. Then with differentiation, you want to make sure that when you're planning for the lesson, that you build in differentiation strategies. Differentiation is really just a way of thinking about teaching and learning. You want to modify, accommodate, adjust curriculum based on student readiness, their interests, and their learning preferences. So essentially, you're using data that you collect on your students to plan for how you will teach your students. And this should maximize learning for all of your students and make it more engaging. So you can differentiate for students either by content, by process, or by product. And then you can use information based on their readiness or development, their level of interest, or their learning style. And with that information, you would gain that through data that you collect on your students. Ways that you can collect data is by doing a pre-assessment. So these are some ideas of different sources where you can get pre-assessment data on your students to see and determine their level of readiness. You can look at student products and work samples to see the best way that they like to show what they know. And you can sometimes just poll your students. So there are multiple ways to assess your students, what they know, and it will help you to determine the best way to teach, group, and prepare your students for learning. With the gradual release of responsibility, that method of learning involves direct explanation, followed by modeling, moving into guided practice with corrective feedback, then independent practice, and then lastly, assessment and or review. So this is a diagram that shows how the gradual release model works. You start off with the teacher responsibility being the greatest. So in that part with direct explanation, that is where you give the focus of the lesson, you tell students what they should know and be able to do, and you're modeling for students. So that is where you as a teacher say, I'm going to do it. So students are listening, they're paying attention, they're engaged because you are telling them exactly what to do and what you want to see them do. Then you gradually release students into guided practice or guided instruction. With that, you and the students can do it whole group, and then you can then have them working and calling out and sharing and answering questions in a whole group. So we as a whole group are doing this together. Then you move into the next phase, which is collaborative. You give students an opportunity to work in collaboration. A lot of times we move from the we do guided instruction to the independent practice and skip the collaborative practice. But that's a very important step in successful instruction. Students should have an opportunity to collaborate and work together. Once they've had that opportunity and you move around the room and you observe and you listen for academic discourse, you give them corrective feedback. And once they've had enough practice, then you move them to the final stage of the independent practice. So with direct explanation, you're going to state your desired outcomes. You would start off by telling students the why it's important, make connections, real world situations. And then you also tell them how you're going to assess them, whether it's going to be formal or informal, throughout or only at the end. How will you assess them? Students want to know that information. Next is the modeling phase. You're going to show them how to do what you expect them to do. At this time, students should be watching you. They should be engaged. They may even sometimes take notes, but the important piece is that you are demonstrating the mastery level for them. You may use think alouds. You may speak orally and go through the process. You want to make sure that you speak clearly and directly to the students. And you also want to check to make sure that students comprehend the information. Then you move into guided practice. With that, it should parallel in some way what you modeled. It gives students a time to work and work together. They can ask questions. You give feedback. You are monitoring students as they work. You are asking probing questions. If you hear misconceptions, you want to address those. You want to make sure that students are participating. And then you assess student understanding throughout in informal means. Then with the guided practice you do together, then the students are now moving into small groups or pairs. You're listening for their level of discussion through academic discourse. And then you determine, do you need to provide further instruction? Do you need to model again? Do you need to pull a small group and work with one group only? Sometimes you may have to go back to the beginning and model again if you get too many questions or too many students that do not understand. And of course, again, during this time, you also provide that corrective feedback. And then the you do part. This is when students move into independent practice. You give them the time to practice by themselves. It should also parallel whatever skill you modeled and what they've worked on in their group. You still want to circulate, and sometimes independent practice can be in pairs or small group, especially if students are working on a project where they have an end product. And then at the end, you want to make sure you close the lesson. Even if you haven't finished everything for the day, you want to do some type of assessment or review because you want to see, have the students begun to meet the learning target. For informal assessment, you could do something as simple as a ticket out of the door or an exit ticket or exit card. You can have them write in a journal. And then with formal assessments, of course, that will be a quiz or a test. You may have them write, or it could be a project where they produce some type of product or performance task. That concludes this module on effective instructional planning. I hope this helps you as you encounter and journey on this new time with the district. And if you would please go in and complete the class evaluation using the Qualtrics link that's included here.